Yeah, well, I'll be there for the election, you know, the 4 days before and the 5 days after.
Okay, yeah, amazing.
And hopefully there's not so much chaos that I can't get out of there on schedule.
Yeah, yeah, fingers crossed.
Oh, we're live.
Here we are.
I missed that. I was fixing my notes. Okay, hello everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I'm the Green Party, or was the Green Party and the Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and advocate for the Eco Socialist program that Angela Walker, my running mate, and I ran on in 2020. So today I just want to announce that our producer, Kris Blankenhorn's wife, delivered a second healthy baby to the family last night. So let's say congratulations and hello to the new kid on the block, and wish Kris and his wife good luck in getting enough sleep in the coming period. So Anna Schiefelbaum is covering for Kris today. And of course, the big news right now is Israel's attacks on Hezbollah and the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah. And we're not going to talk about that today. I'm sure there'll be plenty to talk about next week. But Israel's doing aggression in the name of defense, which is what Russia is doing in the name of invading Ukraine. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Our guest is Kris Parker. You can see him there on the screen. He's a freelance journalist based in Brooklyn who works in photography, video, and print, who is just back from 2 months in Ukraine, which is his second trip to Ukraine. And he's a member of the IWW's Freelance Journalists Union, and he's trained in HEFAT, which stands for Hostile Environment and Emergency First Aid Training, which journalists usually get when they go to the front lines, when they're war correspondents. Kris's articles have appeared in The Nation, Open Democracy, Euromaidan Press, Kyiv Independent, Politico, and other publications. And you can find those articles on his website, www.krisparker.info. And we'll put that link in the chat or on the screen there too. So, after the podcast, check out some of what he's been writing. So, Kris, welcome. And I already know you because we've been working together in the Ukraine Solidarity Network. And I've read your articles, and it's good to see you're back safe and sound. So my first question is, what motivated you to focus on reporting on Ukraine and get involved in Ukraine solidarity work?
Okay, well, thank you for having me. What motivated me? I think, initially I was just in shock at the scale of the war. In the initial days, I felt like this would have just as large of implications as the American invasion of Iraq, for example, on the region. Additionally, due to the participation or let's say the relationship with NATO countries and these kind of dynamics, I was concerned that, there would be a situation amongst certain leftists where people would not be taking the crisis seriously enough and would not be centering Ukrainian perspectives in all this. And so, in March of 2022, I went to Poland and spent a few weeks in Poland, meeting with local activists who had set up essentially mutual aid networks. We're doing a lot of refugee support. Through that work, I eventually, myself and another freelancer, got a ride into Ukraine in April 2022, where we did some work in Lviv on, related to refugees and all these other issues. Spoke with a lot of teachers and just kind of, started learning more about how, the war was affecting all of life and how people were responding to it. And, I was immediately, I don't know if impressed is the right word, but I found it very profound. I thought the level of mobilization amongst all aspects of society was quite profound. And, I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from this situation.
Okay, well, it's been 2.5 years since the full-scale invasion.
Mhm.
and Russia's constantly attacking at the line of contact and in airstrikes all across the country. And then you have hesitancy and uncertainty about continuing Western support. Uh, and so you just back, what is the mood and morale of Ukrainians today in that context?
Yeah. So I've spent a few months in Ukraine, um, each year since the full-scale war started. So 2022, 2023, and this year as well. Approaching about a year in total. And I would say I've noticed a change in the levels of optimism, at least compared to last year. Um, I spent spring and summer of last year in Ukraine, traveling around the country, especially along the east. And I think, for example, prior to the launch of the counteroffensive, there was a lot of high hopes that the counteroffensive would break through the Russian lines and, force Russia into some sort of, retreat or negotiated, withdrawal, some sort of solution. That did not happen. The Ukrainian counteroffensive was essentially defeated by in-depth Russian defensive positions throughout Zaporizhia Oblast, and Ukraine suffered, significant casualties. I was in Zaporizhia at the time during that summer, and I can say anecdotally that like the local hospitals were, borderline overflowing with casualties coming in, and so the situation is quite critical. And that being said, so last autumn, international aid started to experience a decrease in commitment and donations. And then in conjunction with the stalling of the 62 billion aid package from the U.S. government that was stalled for 6 months by essentially Speaker Johnson, that had a dramatic effect on levels of supplies, specifically certain types of ammunition like artillery, where Ukrainian forces were, essentially unable to match Russian firepower, and as a consequence, lost key areas. In February, the city of Avdiivka being a major loss, and since then, the Russians have continued to push from Avdiivka towards Pokrovsk, and as we speak, the Battle of Pokrovsk is developing, and Pokrovsk is a major logistical hub, and if Ukraine loses that, there could be some dire implications for the Donbass section of the front, but we'll see. And so all that to say, casualties have been high. This last time around, I would say that people are certainly exhausted, reasonably so. Everybody knows someone who's in the army, if they're not in the army themselves. And it seems that everybody knows someone or has lost someone close to them. And, if someone hasn't been killed, then they've been injured. And so I think the levels of exhaustion are increasing. The levels of optimism perhaps have dropped. People certainly want the Russians gone. I would say there's uncertainty in regards to how this is going to happen. Russia has more equipment, more soldiers, and they seem to be more comfortable with higher rates of attrition. And Ukraine cannot sustain those losses at the same scale. And so in that sense, I think, people, it's difficult to say. People are exhausted. People, I think there's uncertainty about what the future holds, even though, people definitely, from my experience, want the Russians gone, do not want to live under a Russian-dominated Ukraine. But, we'll see what happens. I think it depends on a few different factors, international aid being one of them, the other being the ability to mobilize fresh soldiers, which is seems to be one of the most primary challenges at the moment. And yes, past summer, mobilization was definitely a hot topic. There seems to be, issues with how it's being conducted. It's not quite popular. And I think this stems from the fact that, in 2022 and even in 2023, there was high levels of people volunteering for the Army, but due to the intensity of the combat, a lot of those people have been wounded, killed, or are exhausted. And so there's a dire need to have some sort of, replenishment of forces. And this is the challenge because Ukraine just has more limited resources to work with. And, people are suffering, definitely.
Yeah. When I read the military analysts, Ukraine is saying, about 1,500 Russian soldiers are dying each week.
Mm-hmm.
And the Ukrainians are losing like 300 or 250. Not the same rate, but that's, you add that up over a year, that's a lot of carnage. That's, over 100,000.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can understand why people don't want to be mobilized. One thing I've heard, and this is from Dennis Pilash, who we both know, he's a Ukrainian socialist and political scientist, a professor, and his draft number came up. And he said he went to the draft board. I don't know, they call it something else. It was draft board when I was drafted here. And he said what struck him was he was the only middle-class person there. The rest, everybody else was working class. And it seemed the mobilization has a class bias to it. And I was wondering if that's something people talk about.
Definitely. I don't have data on this because it's quite hard to come by. But, anecdotally, it seems that, it's definitely stratified by class. If you have money, you can buy your way out. And people who do not have those resources, either financial or, connections of some sort, end up in some of the most precarious positions. And, I was just reading earlier that, the average age of soldiers is north of 45 years old. And from what I've seen, that, that seems to be the case. And yeah, there's, I talk to, travel around, I talk to people, daily, and there seems, everyone will say that, like, the villages are being emptied of men, and, there's probably some truth to that. So if people in the cities who have connections or money, may stand a better chance of avoiding, being sent to some of the, most difficult frontline units.
You alluded to this at the top, but you've talked about the Ukrainian resistance being a popular movement, not just the state and the army. So tell us more about this grassroots resistance movement, and also what kinds of international grassroots support that's independent of the U.S. state or Western governments that have been sending Ukraine some weapons. And what are Ukrainians in this popular movement asking of us internationally in support?
Definitely. Just about every soldier I've spoken to, they all more or less say the same thing, that Ukraine, the military needs more equipment, they need more weapons, they need more ammunition. And they don't understand why these are not being sent in greater numbers. I think there is a perception that is growing that the West is giving Ukraine enough aid to survive, to keep its head above water, but not necessarily enough to defeat the Russians or to drive them out. People talk about like the drip approach to aid, where different weapons that initially were considered beyond the pale have been allocated eventually, but the timeline matters, and the delays do have an effect on the ground, and people are lost while waiting for weapons. That being said, I'm sorry, what was the first part of your question?
Well, what's the grassroots resistance movement and the kind of solidarity those groups are asking for?
Certainly, yeah. Yeah, it seems to be that just about everybody is involved in fundraising for either, different military units, or, for refugee support. There are millions of displaced people, and, they need somewhere to live. They need support, all along the East. Anywhere where there's been, fighting, the areas are destroyed, thoroughly destroyed. In the East, all these small towns and villages are flattened after fighting. And yeah, I would say that, everybody is involved for the most part. And, I think it speaks to this desire to want to be independent from an authoritarian Russia. That being said, of course, maybe motivations differ, after, to some extent, but generally, all common people, I think, are united in opposition to this war of aggression. And yeah, so there are significant grassroots volunteer drives to raise supplies, to raise money, to buy supplies. And on one hand, it's necessary because, the Ukrainian state certainly has issues with corruption and had issues prior to the full-scale war. And, cannot necessarily match the capacity of the Russian state in regards to mobilizing resources. And so that being said, I think to survive, people have had to mobilize in whatever way they see fit. And so you see a lot of people raising funds for either, their unit or friends or families units for, different equipment. This could be everything from like winter clothing to, night vision or whatever. Lately, there's been a lot of fundraising for drones, like FPV drones, first person view drones have become a critical weapon, and they're relatively inexpensive, and people can modify consumer ones and then essentially turn them into flying bombs. And so you see a lot of fundraising for this. And medical supplies as well. There's a lot of like networks of medical professionals who work with colleagues around Europe and the US, collecting medical supplies and getting them to hospitals and clinics around the country. I think the levels of consumption for these supplies are so high that this is deemed as necessary. And there are issues with procurement, and so a lot of times volunteers feel like they can do things quicker and more efficiently without getting bogged down in bureaucracy. And so, yeah, basically just everyone I speak to always says that, I think without like the volunteer mobilization that Ukraine would have been defeated in 2022.
Okay, Kris and I actually got some links to groups asking for support. And so, Anna, why don't we put Kris's 3 that are all Instagram links, and maybe Kris can tell us a little bit about each of them.
Yeah, sure. Are they on?
Yeah, they're up.
Oh, okay, great.
In the chat.
Okay, let's see. So, hopefully people can link to those. Maybe we can put them in the chat afterwards or the description. Anyway, so the first one, Unia Ophthalmica, is a community organization based in Zaporizhia that raises donations of primarily medical supplies, and they supply a lot of local hospitals within Zaporizhia city and throughout non-occupied Zaporizhia Oblast. And they've done a lot of critical work. They work with, a lot of doctors, and I can attest to their credibility. They're very sound. They're legitimate. The other one, Street Aid Daily, is a anti-authoritarian collective, anarchist collective in Odessa, and they work with solidarity collectives, and they support anti-authoritarian soldiers or formations within the military. The last one, Hospitalers, is a volunteer combat medic unit, and they work with the military and do everything that combat medics do. And I've met a few of them before, and can also say that they do a lot of good work, and they risk their lives to help. And oftentimes people are killed working with them, but it's the nature of the war. And so, yeah, if people want to donate, those are three of amongst many. There's plenty of places to get involved in or get involved with, which I think there's probably a need to collect and collate all these different initiatives into one spot, so people outside of Ukraine can figure out where to send money to. But right now, these are three that I would recommend.
Yeah, I'm thinking the Ukraine Solidarity Network website should have a page with these things. Well, I have three as well, and Anna, if you can put the first one on. It's called Krilla, which is something Dennis Bondar, who's been on this podcast, is now the CEO of. It's based in New Orleans, and they focus on medical and other humanitarian aid. And right now they're in a campaign to raise $8,000 for a water purification facility to help desalinate salty water around Mykolaiv, which they got a problem there. Russia bombed their water plant. And so they don't have, drinkable water. So this is what you can get for $8,000. I mean, I've seen Dennis post, in one of these chats, what it looks like. It looks like, like the machine room for an Olympic-sized pool. It's not going to give water to the whole city, but it will help. And then the next one, if it's up, is okay. We got Krilla up. The next one will come up soon. It's a campaign by the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign in the United Kingdom, and this focuses on. Let me get back to a little description I wrote. This is a fundraiser for rescue workers who are in the independent trade union of miners in Ukraine. And they got a real problem because they're the people that come in when there's a bombing. And they're facing what the Russians do, double tap bombing. They did it last night in Sumy. They bombed a hospital. The first responders came in and they hit it second time. So these people, this is for all kinds of support for them, equipment, basically. And you can click on the link. They got a little video where the rescue workers talk about why they need support. And then the third one is the Solidarity Collectives, who are an anti-authoritarian network. They are, basically anarchists in Ukraine. And they do a lot of military, aid to the people on the front line, people who come from their anarchist collectives and are in the armed forces, as well as humanitarian aid. And we got there a link both to their website and their X Twitter page. And so you can follow what they're doing. And this has support. You may know Taras Billis. He's a socialist with Sociální Ruch. Just won the Daniel Singer Prize, which is this international prize for the best socialist essay in a year. And he got a $10,000 prize, and he donated it to these solidarity collectives. So, and Taras is not only a writer and a socialist activist, he joined the Ukrainian armed forces the day after Russia's full-scale invasion. So, anyway, there are ways we can help. And my sense from, talking to Kris and people like Dennis Bondar, who's in communication over there all the time, and Dennis Pilach and other Ukrainians, is it means a lot to them. They are feeling isolated, and they're particularly pissed at those people who call themselves on the left and they're apologizing for Russian imperialism. I mean, I'll stop there. They are, they're not happy with so-called leftists. They can't tell the difference between the aggressor and the victim.
Mm-hmm.
So those are ways people can help. And let me ask you one more question, and then we'll get to questions in the chat. And you mentioned this, everybody's waiting for this U.S. presidential election. The Ukrainians, Putin's waiting, other European allies of Ukraine are waiting. Mm-hmm. Countries like China and Brazil that have this other 6-point plan that Zelensky said is, they're kind of principles, not really a peace plan. Members of the Congress, everybody's waiting to see who the next president is before they figure out what their next move is. Mm-hmm. But I'm sure Ukrainians have been talking about this election. So what have they been saying?
Yeah, I think, it can vary. I think generally most people are suspicious of Trump and the Republicans based on, the 6-month delay in aid, Trump's history of ridiculous statements, all that. At the same time, like I said earlier, there is a perception that, that the Biden admin has been too cautious with its aid, citing risks of escalation. And in the meantime, Ukrainians are dying while they wait for adequate equipment. That being said, it's not just a matter of equipment. There are other issues to be resolved, but the equipment makes a big difference. And so, I think on one hand, people see the drip approach as untenable and unsustainable. And on the other hand, they see Trump and his bombastic statements and are skeptical, to say the least. It's a friend of mine. I was discussing this with him, and he's a volunteer who works up and down the front lines, delivering aid to military units and evacuating civilians and things like that. And he kind of just said, like, we're going to be, in a difficult place no matter what. And so, what's important for us is just to kind of consolidate what we have and work as hard as we can, and, not expect too much either way. But that being said, I think the election certainly will make a difference. But, I think it speaks to the levels of exhaustion. People are, worn out. It's been, 1,000 days of bombings and air raids and, intense combat for the soldiers and, families being ripped apart and losing loved ones. It certainly has been easy by any metric. And yeah, so I think, people that I've spoken to, I can't speak for everyone in the country, obviously, but people that I've spoken to are, kind of resigned to the fact that it's going to be a difficult few years, no matter what happens, even if the fighting stops today. But that being said, at least the folks I've spoken to are certainly far more skeptical of a Trump presidency than they are of a Harris presidency.
But still skeptical that she would continue the sort of drip of aid, not really.
Exactly. Exactly.
Zelensky was in the United States this last week, speaking at the UN and going to the White House. And at the last minute, he got a meeting with Trump, who agreed Thursday night to meet Friday morning. And Zelensky was there at Trump Tower. But, my reading of the press, the victory plan that Zelensky brought has not been made public. Mm-hmm. But reading, what reporters have been able to get, talking to sources and the Ukrainian government, the American government, other governments off the record, as anonymous sources, not so much off the record as anonymous sources. The thing that Ukraine wants, and they don't seem to be getting, is guarantees from the West that whatever kind of agreement there is with Russia, and the West will guarantee Ukraine's security. And you get different reports. Some say that means NATO. Others say, well, it could be a guarantee independent of NATO, like the Budapest Memorandum, but with real teeth. The Budapest Memorandum is what the West said, yeah, we'll recognize your territorial integrity and sovereignty, Ukraine, and Russia signed it too, if you give the nukes back to Russia, the Soviet nukes that Ukraine inherited. And they did, but then when, Russia invaded in 2014 and full scale in 2022, the West didn't do anything militarily anyway to intervene based on the Budapest Memorandum. But what I'm, looking at the peace negotiations back in March, April 2022, when, the Russian line is that the West sabotaged. It was Boris Johnson, etc. But if you read actually what Ukrainians like David Arakhamia, who's, head of the Rada, their Congress or Parliament, he said, we wanted security guarantees, and Johnson wouldn't give that to us. The West wouldn't give that to us. And without that, we can't sign on an agreement with Russia because we don't trust them. And it seems they didn't get it this time. That seemed to me to be the core of this victory plan, along with a constant supply, a secure multi-year supply of weapons, including permission for deep strikes, and then economic reconstruction and those things. But that seemed to be, the diplomatic sticking point is that the West, because if the West does give those guarantees, like they bring them into NATO, Article 5, that puts NATO in conflict at war with Russia as long as Russia's attacking Ukraine. And they don't want to do that. So, Ukraine's looking for some kind of guarantee and they're not getting it. So that's just been my observation of what went on this week. I don't know whether Zelensky considers the weapons he did get and the committee did get from Biden. I guess he'd call it a half victory. It wasn't the whole victory plan, but it keeps Ukraine going. I don't know. How do you think people in Ukraine, are looking at what happened this week?
I can't say for sure. I think I haven't been able to speak with everyone that I'm usually in contact with today. Certainly the latest announcement for more aid is encouraging because the aid, it's necessary. It's not, sometimes debates around aid are framed as if you just cut it off, the war will be over, Ukraine will be forced to negotiate and blah, blah, blah. And, I don't think people understand that the aid means air defense. It means, providing Ukraine the ability to defend itself, to stop further Russian advances. And when Russian advances mean destroyed cities, destroyed towns, destroyed environment, destroyed ecology, all that. And so, I'm sure the announcement of aid is encouraging to some degree, but, I think the bigger problems are, the disparity in available resources regarding soldiers, the ability to get more soldiers onto the field. And so some of the larger questions haven't been resolved. And yeah, it's unclear how this is going to unfold.
Okay, why don't we go to some of the questions that people have put in the chat and let Kris deal with those. BD Dimmitt, was Putin's revised position on nukes a hot topic before you left? That was Wednesday. That's
yeah.
very
I was already back in the U.S. when they announced that they were revising their positions. I think, again, anecdotally, people have spoken to or I'm in contact with, there's zero trust of the Russian government, of Putin specifically. So I don't think people would be surprised if a nuclear weapon was used, but, everybody hopes that that's never does happen, of course. But yeah, in short, I was in the U.S. when that was announced.
Yeah, I just want to say I think Putin's bluffing. He made nuclear threats the minute he invaded and said, don't send any weapons to Ukraine, not a bullet or else. and was implying nukes. And he keeps doing that. I
Yeah.
think he has intimidated Biden into, this slow drip of weapon systems, and now not allowing Ukraine to use U.S. supplied weapons to strike the air bases from which Russia is putting these devastating glide bombs on top of troops and civilians. So it seems to, but to me, Putin would be stupid to go nuke, because the U.S. would destroy its military with conventional forces. Everybody, the Russian army in Ukraine and its, supply lines will be destroyed. It would be devastating for Russia. They're just not that strong a military power. And he don't want that. He don't want a real war with NATO, as much as he says that's who he's fighting. He wants to pick on little Ukraine and leave it at that. So anyway, that's my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I could be wrong, but my gut tells me that like it would be unlikely for him to use a nuclear weapon. I could be wrong, but that being said, like the Ukrainian army is in Kursk right now, and additionally, per the Russian constitution, they've annexed these 4 oblasts, which they don't control, and again, Ukraine is using Western weapons on these oblasts, so let's hope it's just a bluff.
Yeah, just to be clear, the position Putin announced on Wednesday, he announced it as Zelensky was speaking to the UN General Assembly. And he said if a non-nuclear power attacks Russia with the support of a nuclear power, so he's talking about Ukraine and the US or France or the UK, we can respond with nukes. And as he was speaking, Ukraine was in Kursk, Russian oblast, across the border from Kharkiv in Ukraine, and using US supplied weapons to sit on Russian territory. So he's saying he'd go nuclear for Ukraine doing what it's already doing, which tells me that was more for show than a real threat. So let's get up another question. The Struggle Video News. Do they know that the U.S. imports Russian uranium has increased? Seems like the U.S. treats the boycotts like a joke. I guess they is me and Kris, or the U.S. government, whoever it is. I will say right off, I mean, I've been part of a petition drive to tell the U.S. government to end uranium imports, which I think actually they did. I know it was up for discussion. I can't remember if that passed. But yeah, I agree that there's a lot of looking the other way at the sanctions against Russia.
Mm-hmm.
You want to talk about that, Kris?
I don't have any particular insight into the uranium imports, but certainly there's a lot of loopholes within the sanctions, and ways for entities to get around them.
Yeah, one big thing, especially with commodities trade, like oil or any of the other, all the other things coming out of Russia, timber, gas, minerals, is companies will set up a subsidiary in, somewhere in the Middle East, like Abu Dhabi or Doha, and they will just do the trade from there. And the Swiss government, I know, has said explicitly, yeah, that's not a problem for us. We have sanctions on Russia, but if it's done from Doha or Abu Dhabi, we don't care. So it goes on, and Russia's getting around a lot of it.
Definitely.
Edie Dimmitt, does the Holodomor come up often in regards to the Land for Peace discussions, or are there any such discussions?
I mean, yeah, it comes up as an example of, Russian aggression, for sure, and fuels a skepticism of the modern iteration of, the Russian government. Land for Peace, it's not a popular idea at all, but, again, for people I've spoken to over the summer, there's an attitude that it might be necessary in some way. there's not a clear idea of how to avoid this situation. If they can't push the Russians out, if the West isn't going to help them do it, then what's the alternative? People almost unanimously do not believe, though, that trading land for peace is a long-term solution. The general consensus that I've experienced is that any sort of settlement, temporary, will be temporary, and that people would expect the Russian military to regroup and push further in the future. I don't know what timeline they're envisioning, but this land for peace, is not necessarily viewed as a viable option. And we should remember that it's not land necessarily. It's cities and homes and people's lives and their histories and their families, and that are living on this land. And so, yeah, it's complicated, but definitely the Holodomor comes up often, and land for peace does come up, but not necessarily in a positive context.
Yeah, for anybody listening is not familiar with the Holodomor, it's all the people that died, when the Stalinist regime in the 30s was just taking all the grain out of the harvest in Ukraine and really across the steppe all the way to Kazakhstan, and millions starved to death. And it was, a total, I guess, war crime. It was a crime against humanity for sure. And that's, a lot of Ukrainians, when they think of Russia, they think of that. And they just don't want to be under Russia's thumb.
Exactly.
The Struggle Video News. Do people in Ukraine know that the Biden administration makes no complaint when India massively increases its import of Russian oil?
Yeah, I mean, people are definitely aware of the inconsistencies and hypocrisy of, all the various governments involved, the allied governments. And yeah, I don't know. People are, they don't approve.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that probably contributes to the, lower morale when people in Ukraine don't feel the West really has their back. And, it was kind of giving them enough to, hold the front line, but not to push the Russians out.
Yeah.
I think that probably fits into that category. At war with dust, should Jill Stein's arguably dubious comments on Ukraine deter otherwise sympathetic leftists from voting for her?
Well, I don't want to tell people how to vote. I think there are significant issues with Stein's approach to Russia and Ukraine. She, the positions that she has iterated are thoroughly rejected amongst Ukrainians. And, so I would say she suffers from a severe credibility problem. And I haven't seen much effort from her to amend that.
Yeah, well, she's kind of pushing the war criminal by Mehdi Hassan in that interview, which she then put out in a statement, and all the tankies jumped on her right away. You look at her Twitter feed, and all the usual suspects, the people apologizing for Russia's invasion, really jumped on her. She hadn't backed down, so I think that's maybe a little bit of progress. Yeah. I've written an article, and I'll get it in the chat for you if you haven't seen it. I think I posted it here before, called It Against the Current, which is the most recent iteration. It's called Socialist Support for Jill Stein. And if you read that, I say critical support, and I have a whole section on how her Ukraine position is just divorced from reality. In her platform, she says, we need negotiations, and we should stop, feeding the war. She says something abstract, by which she means we should stop sending weapons to Ukraine. which means weaken their position in any negotiations. And as I point out in that article, she has not talked to the Greens in Ukraine, to the leftists, in Sotsialny Group, the socialist group, the Solidarity Collective anarchists, the feminist workshop in Lviv, the environmentalists like Svetlana Ramako, who we've had on this podcast, climate activists, and also pleading for the West to, strengthen its sanctions on Russian oil and gas. She hadn't talked to any of those people. I think she's been hearing more from the pacifists, like Medea Benjamin, and the campus, like Consortium News. And so, and I debated her, now it's almost 2 years ago, well, a year and a half ago, and she doesn't know much about Ukraine, and she certainly hasn't talked to Ukrainians. So what I come down to, this is my personal opinion, is look, the Democrats are responsible for the genocide of Gaza and just letting, all this bombing go on in Lebanon now with no pushback, and years of no pushback on the settlements and the whole Israeli expansion project. Of course, the Republicans are worse, but if you want to vote against genocide, Jill's been good on that issue. So for me, it's a critical vote for Jill, just to, use my vote as my voice. But if you're in a swing state, a battleground state, I'm not going to shame you if you think you need to vote defensively for Harris to stop Trump. Although if I wouldn't do that, but I can understand why people would. So anyway, yeah, Jill, I mean, shoot, when I talk to Ukrainian leftists, the first thing I get an earful about is what is wrong with Jill Stein? Doesn't she understand what we're going through? Why doesn't she, ask us what we think? So anyway, that's my position.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, my internet was cutting in and out, so hopefully you can hear me just fine. But yes, exactly. The positions that Stein has voiced, run counter to reality in many cases.
Beatty Dimmitt, how about NATO U.S. backing off for peace as an alternative to land for peace?
Do you mean, do you mean NATO and the U.S. agreeing to not bring Ukraine into NATO, or?
Well, I think maybe what he means is if the U.S. would offer Russia security guarantees, because they say they're afraid of NATO expansion, would that convince Russia to, withdraw back to Russia from Ukraine, since the U.S. has said, here's what we're going to do to make sure you feel safe. And I actually advocated that from the beginning of the war, that the U.S. should have a diplomatic initiative with Russia, saying, yeah, we want to talk about your security concerns, and let's negotiate. And, what happened was Putin on December 21st, 2021, a couple months before he invaded, made this proposal. And it was like written up as a treaty. And he told the West to sign here. And what it did was say NATO should move back to its 1991 military footprint. That means, right before the unification of Germany. And he expected an answer in weeks with at that time 30 nations in NATO who have to act by consensus. I mean, it was an unrealistic proposal. The U.S. did respond in writing after consulting with the NATO allies on about January. No, it was in mid-February. But Putin had already made up his mind. He said, he rejected that and invaded. But I think if that's what you're talking about, Beatty, I think, yeah, the U.S. should be diplomatically with bullhorns, shouting out to the world. We want to make sure Russia feels secure, and we have no designs on them. And who runs Russia is up to the Russian people. I think that's what the U.S. should do. I don't know if Russia would take that as an answer. I don't think they will until they realize they can't win in Ukraine. And then that would give them a face-saving off-ramp. We got our security guarantee. We're happy. So I don't know. What do you think of that, Kris?
I think, it's important to really, try to figure out mix at all. I don't know, I can't say for sure that that would solve the issue. I don't know. Russia is certainly an authoritarian state, and this kind of, the Russian dissidents speak of, speak in terms of Russia being, quasi-fascist with like this kind of Eurasian orthodoxy ideology, and it's like drive to restore the glory of the empire and things like that. And so, it's for me, it's hard to know to what extent Russia is motivated by like rational material concerns, or the leadership, I should say, versus like these other kind of ideological factors that may influence decision making. But certainly, some sort of should be negotiated to prevent a larger war from breaking out. But I don't know. I personally think as long as Putin is empowered, there's going to be issues within the region for sure. It's up to the Russian people to try to get him out.
Yeah, BD followed up in the chat, and what he meant was taking pressure off from the expansion. I think he means the NATO expansion, possibly combined with an agreement to cooperatively move toward the elimination of fossil fuels. There we go. I think, that's what the U.S. should be offering. Now, that's a hard pill for Russia to swallow because they'd be dependent on U.S. and Chinese technology to go green in energy and forego their fossil and gas wealth, which would make them basically dependent on aid from outside. But that's the kind of place we got to go if we're going to deal with the climate crisis. So that should be on the table. I don't think Putin, because he's ideologically committed to restoring a Russian empire and making Russia great again, rather than solving problems like the climate crisis and, a good standard of living for his own people.
Yeah.
And, BD adds, this is where I have issues with Dr. Stein, as her idea of diplomacy would be to accept Russia-occupied portions of Ukraine as Russia's sovereign territory. There you go. And I think, yes, that's what everybody from Medea Benjamin to Donald Trump are proposing. And it's shameful. We ought to be better than that as Greens in supporting an anti-colonial struggle, a national liberation struggle of the Ukrainians. And, diplomacy should lead toward Ukrainian freedom and a good, positive relationship between the West and Russia that's constructive around issues like climate and security. But to think, as we've been saying, that, okay, you get a treaty, Russia gets, the land it's conquered, and it's going to stop there, or it's going to be, acceptable to Ukrainians. I mean, think of all the, millions of people that have either been displaced or are living under Russian occupation, where, they have to take a Russian passport if they want to get social services. A lot of the children, tens of thousands, have been kidnapped to Russia. Putin's under, there's a arrest warrant out for him from the International Criminal Court for that. That status quo is, Kris was indicating, is not acceptable to Ukrainians. So, yeah, there's a lot more to say about that, but let's see if we got more questions or comments. Should the U.S. lead a negotiation for peace?
This is tough because, on one hand, it's Ukraine who is bearing the brunt of all the consequences of all this. The war's being fought on their territory. Russia chose to initiate this war. And so there's certainly a role for the U.S. to encourage negotiations or participate to some extent. I think it's unreasonable to say otherwise. I think Ukraine should lead them, but it needs to be in conjunction with these other governments. That being
It looks like, okay.
Oh, I'm here.
Yeah, you
I'm sorry. Okay. I'm not sure what you heard last, but essentially, the Russians often put out statements saying they will negotiate directly with the U.S. and bypass the Ukrainians, which, I don't think is acceptable. I think Ukraine should be centered in all this, obviously. But that being said, should be to ending the war on just terms. And if that means the U.S. has to be involved, then so be it.
Yeah, I would agree. The U.S. has a role to play supporting. I think their stated policy of, nothing about the Ukrainians without the Ukrainians. In other words, it's Ukraine that has to make decisions on what's an acceptable deal. But behind the scenes, you got to wonder if Zelensky is not being pushed to accept a so-called land for peace deal. I mean, John Kirby, the spokesperson for the National Security Council, said this week that it's unlikely that Ukraine will recover its occupied lands. And then he added, but that's up for Ukraine to decide about. But when people like him are saying that, it's kind of pushing the Ukrainians to accept a land for peace kind of deal. And if you read, the news on this and the foreign policy establishment's discussion on this in publications like Foreign Affairs, there's a lot of the foreign policy, national security elite that seem to be pushing Ukraine to, compromise on the land Russia conquered. And even there, without a security guarantee, I don't think Ukraine's going to go for it because they don't trust the Russians. I mean, I mentioned the Budapest Memorandum. There were 3 other treaties that Russia broke when they invaded Ukraine and intervened in 2014, not to mention 2022. So there's a U.S. role, but it's got to be really doing what their public stance is. It's up to Ukraine, and we'll, encourage, fruitful negotiations. B.D. Dimmitt. Expensive arming other nations is an onus the U.S. is bearing, with so many needs at home going unfulfilled. It looks like Kris is frozen again.
Okay, sorry, am I here?
Yeah, you're coming in and out, but you're here now.
Okay, yeah. This is really frustrating. My internet is so terrible. So expensive army other nations. I mean, yeah, it's true. But I don't think we should counterpose support for Ukraine necessarily with, things that are needed in the U.S. Both can be done easily. The problem is that we have, a government that doesn't work for the majority of people, from what I can tell, the main primary reason why the U.S. is even supporting Ukraine is because its own geopolitical goals overlap with those of Ukrainians who do not want to be dominated by Russia. And so there's overlap, but it's not necessarily, the goals aren't necessarily identical. And then we're seeing that in how, this drip approach to aid is affecting the situation. So yeah, of course, the U.S. is doing a job taking care of its own citizens and other people that live here. But I think we should be careful not to give credence to a narrative that it's because of Ukraine. There's a lot of excess and way, undemocratic, or, I think everyone can probably agree our entire system's fairly undemocratic, even though it pretends otherwise. And so, yeah, of course, there's a need for a lot of resources to be allocated across the country. But, also people in Ukraine are being bombed, and we should, if there's the availability to alleviate that, and I think it's important to try to.
Yeah, well, I think also just to, put this in perspective, the arming of other countries, in other words, sending, and we usually sell weapons to other countries, and sometimes we'll loan them the money and then they're in debt to us so they can buy those weapons. That is a small portion of our military spending. The lion's share of it goes to maintaining a global military operation with 700 or 800 foreign military bases. The Ukrainian portion of that is less than, if I remember correctly, less than 2% of the military budget. This money we're giving to Ukraine. It's like 0.3% of our gross domestic product. You know, that's changing the sofa compared to the federal budget. So to say, and you know, people are saying this, are people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and you know, Vance, what's his first name? The guy running for vice president. They're saying, yeah, they're saying, you know, Ukraine is taking money out of, you know, what we need for domestic needs. But of course, those Republicans will never vote for any social program. It's
exactly
bizarre, and it's frustrating when people who consider themselves on the left, you know, repeat that. You know, Kris is right. We got money to take care of our needs here and also support Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
Just more taxes on the rich, less spending on the military, and you know, that would give us more money than we would know what to do with, except we need to put it into a climate emergency program, a real Green New Deal. So that banner means the hour is up. So, Kris, I really appreciate you coming on. Is there any last thought you want to share with people?
Just want to say thank you for bringing me on and for your interest and support. You know, I encourage everyone to, you know, keep those in Ukraine in mind. Push back against people who want to conflate the government with, you know, the rest of the population. You know, people are experiencing a very difficult time and should be supported. And you know, they would really appreciate, or they do, and I'm sure will continue to appreciate any support that they receive.
And Anna, let's put Kris's website up again in the chat so people can you know, copy that and maybe go read some of the articles he's written about Ukraine, as I mentioned, and everything from The Nation and Politico to some Ukrainian publications like the Kyiv Independent and the Euromaidan Press, or Maidan Press, however they pronounce it. There it is. Yeah. So, okay, well, next week, I think we're going to need to talk about particularly what's going on in Lebanon and Gaza and, you know, the Middle East, and you know, try to evaluate that, talk about what we can do, and we'll try to understand that better. So, you know, that's probably be the topic next week, next Saturday, 3 p.m. Eastern time. And if you can't see the live stream, it goes out on all the podcast platforms on Monday morning. So thanks everybody for being here, and we'll see you next week.
All right.